Great, let's see what happened there if everyone's joined in the room now. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you in this Teams meeting for this afternoon's webinar. We're just checking that everything is looking okay on the team side. Anybody who might be joining just as we've turned past and the webinar hour is starting, we'll give it maybe 1 or 2 more minutes before we kick off. You can still hear me okay, Stuart and Anna? Just a thumbs up. Cool.
You can tell we're old school, James, because we actually do the physical rather than finding the button.
Yeah. Well, I got the message. That's all I can. Great. I'm just getting a couple of other requests for the link coming in through Teams. So I'm just going to share that with a few people that might be missing the link. Okay. Great. So I think we've had a couple more people join us in the last minute, and we'll just wait till 12:32, and then we'll go ahead and get started with the webinar. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. On the call, there's myself. I'm James Stix, the service manager for Noteable, which we'll be talking about this afternoon. And we have a guest speaker joining us, Stuart King on the webinar, who's joining us from the University of Edinburgh as well, and Anna from JISC. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Make sure that is looking okay for everyone. Great, and I'm going to even try and have Teams here on the screen side by side so I don't miss any chat updates if we get any questions as we go along. Okay, great. So hopefully everyone can see my screen nice and clearly there. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar on EDINA's Noteable service. This afternoon, we'll be talking about a cloud computational notebook service that has been developed by EDINA at the University of Edinburgh. As I mentioned, we have a couple people joining us on this afternoon's webinar. Anna Clough is joining us kindly from JISC for any questions or to provide further information about licensing Noteable. And Stuart King is joining us from the School of Math at the University of Edinburgh to share a bit of insight about his experience using the service. So let's kick off this afternoon's webinar with an introduction to EDINA, which is where the service has been developed. EDINA is a center of digital expertise at the University of Edinburgh. We've been around for quite a bit of time now, a couple of decades, and have built a robust set of renowned online service packages and provisions. And we deliver online services at scale based here at the university. There's a portfolio of services that have been developed by EDINA, now spanning across over 5,000 customers. This includes services like Digimap and Digimap for Schools, and the Noteable service as well. We follow best practice service delivery in the industry, following in the ITIL regulatory framework. And we also follow GDPR and digital accessibility for the service across all our services. I'll go into a little bit more on how we provide support for the Noteable service in a couple of slides. We have a help desk available Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 during working hours. And we're proud to say we have a high record of service uptime with 99.99% being our service delivery aim. And there's a dedicated team of software developers and service delivery on staff supporting Noteable. So with some context on EDINA and what we do, what Noteable provides is a managed cloud-based computational notebook service. It is hosted here across the University of Edinburgh servers. It has been designed with input from both academics and learning technologists from across the University of Edinburgh in its early days, and now has spanned to, as mentioned, thousands of users across multiple institutions. And we continuously learn from their usage experience and the feedback we receive to make improvements and updates to the service. In essence, Noteable provides access to a variety of coding environments that are specifically pre-configured and designed for teaching and learning. And these are based on the Jupyter Computational Notebook interface and Provision, which is a widely used open source technology. And this helps us provide a service that guarantees consistent coding environments for all users. So everyone accesses from the same page on a course, but they get their own individual user environment and storage when they get Noteable. So what features are included as part of the service? There is a variety of notebook types, and we'll go into some detail on what the standard notebook looks like and what's included in it on the next slide. The notebook types that are included on Noteable are packaged across different types of notebook that you can select when you access the service. They're based on Jupyter notebooks and include access to languages such as Python and R, and you get a variety of interfaces and notebook options available when you first access Noteable in the notebook selection page. These are predetermined and pre-configured from user requests, as well as EDINA having curated the most popular packages according to different subject needs. So we have, for example, a geospatial notebook that's pre-configured with geoscience libraries and geospatial libraries, as well as a chemistry notebook and machine learning notebook, which might, for example, include some AI and machine learning libraries. These are all pre-installed, managed, and maintained within each notebook. And they are accessed from inside of your course environment. So Noteable is fully integrated into your virtual learning environment through an LTI connection, which is a secure connection between Noteable as an external tool and your existing platform. And that means that the tool can be accessed from inside of a course within your learning environment. And it comes pre-configured with other features to assist the teaching process. So it includes collaborative coding, where you can share a link for others to view the notebook that you are working on and edit the code that you are working on in that notebook. You have multiple markers that can access from inside of the same course to manage assignments on Noteable. And this includes auto-grading of Python code using extensions that come included as part of the service. Each user has 10 gigabytes of permanent storage every time they access the Noteable environment, and every time they access the files that they have been working on will persist and have been saved. And each user also gets 4 gigabytes of RAM allocated. Here is a breakdown of what the standard notebook, as it's called on Noteable, includes. These are some of the most popular Pythonic libraries. They have been selected by category and specific use. So you can see the Python notebook, the standard notebook on Noteable, includes packages such as data science libraries, data visualization tools, machine learning libraries, as well as a variety of other uses that are general purpose use for the standard uses that we see Noteable in teaching and learning. There are a variety of support materials that come included as part of the service. And we have some example notebooks that are available, and these are hosted on GitHub repositories, which can easily be cloned inside of Noteable using a simple button for cloning Git. There are a number of resources available per language type. So there are some Python resources available that showcase different teaching and learning uses of Noteable, as well as equivalent R notebook examples. And there are a number of different testimonials and use cases available for testing and for trying out what can be done with Noteable. As part of the service, we, as mentioned earlier, also aim for 99.99% uptime. And this is a publicly available status page that we provide to help give confidence on the service status at any given time when you're using the service, as we're aware that it's used in key teaching and learning periods. Over the last couple of years, Noteable has grown quite significantly from the University of Edinburgh to over 10,000 users from across different courses and different subject areas to a variety of other universities, Russell Group universities, European universities. And we now have started to see different user group representatives sprout from across these universities to share best practice and share feedback. And this is really helpful for us because we can receive continual feedback that helps us when we make updates in between semesters. So what comes included with Noteable? When you first subscribe to the service, we offer some Q&A sessions with anyone who's interested in first adopting the service or is getting started with the service. And this comes looking ahead of the subscription as well as part of the onboarding post-subscription. There's a dedicated technical team available to work with your virtual learning environment administrators to help set up Noteable via that LTI connection for the first time. And similar to this, we can have webinars as part of our onboarding, which can also include some guest champion users that provide further information on how Noteable can best be used in teaching and learning. And if you're thinking about how you first get access to Noteable, the subscription licensing is done through JISC and the CHEST agreement. This is a standard license agreement for higher education in the UK and offers both per seat pricing on a single multi-year option as well as site-wide pricing for those larger campus needs. And we've seen subscriptions that use Noteable across large course cohorts from 200 to 300 students, all the way down to a handful of students, perhaps in postgraduate courses. So there are different options available for different needs. And thanks, Anna, for sharing the link to the agreement there on the chat. And just a couple of testimonials to wrap up the introduction with. As mentioned, Noteable is being used across a number of different subject areas. And one thing we've heard over and over again is that it's very easy to get started with Noteable. If you're just accessing a virtual course environment for the first time, say as part of your undergraduate course, or if you're a novice coder, it is a lot less intimidating to access Noteable from inside of a course which has already been curated for teaching and learning than, say, having to download software and get started on your own device. And it's also been helpful for assignments, specifically coding exercises and mathematical problems on one platform. And specifically with the increased demands for these types of skills, having something that is integrated into a course environment can help save a lot of time when you're setting things up from a core course module to workshops. It's nice having something that is integrated, is what we've been hearing time and time again. And that brings us nicely over to the guest speaker that we have for this afternoon's webinar. So it's my pleasure to introduce Stuart King, who is a member of the School of Mathematics here at the University of Edinburgh, as well as a number of other roles and interesting things that he's doing here. And so without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Stuart, to tell us a little bit more about your experience.
Thanks very much. Right, shall I share my screen if you want to stop sharing?
Yes, just stopping sharing there, Stuart.
I'll just take over. Thanks. Right, I should confess I'm working on a very tiny laptop screen, so I'm going to hope that you can all see that. And apologies for the little bar across the top, but that means I can keep both sets of windows open, which makes me feel slightly happier on a tiny laptop. I think after that quick introduction to Noteable, I have to say I'm not sure I'm going to say anything that's very different, but maybe lots of kind of reinforcements of the points that James made in different ways. So I'm going to take you through a little bit about my history with teaching coding over the last few years, and in particular kind of using Noteable to do that. I thought what might be helpful is just a little bit background on me, as I think it's very likely there are lots of people that don't know who I am. So just to know where I'm coming from and kind of the sorts of things that I've been doing. So my background's in applied maths, and as part of that kind of academic upbringing, there was lots and lots of coding going on. Originally in all sorts of languages that look like Fortran and Pascal and things like that. Bit of MATLAB. But around 2007, I shifted across to using principally Python for research based things. And I joined, while after that, I joined the University of Edinburgh first as a lecturer in mathematics, and then later reader. I was director of teaching in mathematics for 4 years, and during that time involved in lots of discussions about kind of sort of strategy of how we teach coding within the school, and in particular I was involved in a kind of substantive review that we did all of our teaching around coding within the School of Maths. Before that, I was involved a bit in restructuring some teaching of coding to maths students in St Andrews, and then much more recently, so over the last sort of 3-4 years, I've been very heavily involved in teaching for another institute within University of Edinburgh called the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which is an interdisciplinary, a newly set up interdisciplinary institute that sits in College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, so drawing on a wide range of students from across very different backgrounds and teaching data science and various aspects of kind of coding to those students. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. In terms of what I propose to cover, then I'm going to talk a little bit about what teaching in School of Maths in Edinburgh looked like before we transitioned over to using Noteable, the sorts of things that we were doing, what we observed as the benefits of switching over to Noteable as a system, and kind of key features that Noteable has that really I think are the reason that I keep using it, essentially. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of these experiences teaching students from very different, diverse kind of backgrounds, lots with no previous coding experience at all, coding, and talk a little bit about some of the assessment strategies that we've been using, and particularly MB Grader. If you haven't seen that before, it's a useful sort of auto marking tool that comes along with this kind of notebook environments, and in particular is in Noteable. Yeah, so pre-Noteable, what were we doing? So I arrived in University of Edinburgh having come straight from St Andrews, in fact. In St Andrews Maths, we just transitioned our big first year experience of coding towards Python, and we did that at the time. Anaconda was this new sort of big packaging up of Python libraries and Python kind of IDEs and so on. And so we used that, still very much in a kind of computer classroom type setting. So stuff was pre-installed on those machines. When I arrived in Edinburgh, really the environments were quite split between the sorts of things we were doing with undergraduate students and the sorts of things we were doing with MSc students. So for undergraduates, really, we didn't do a lot of what you might call proper programming. It was all involved with a language called Maple, which is a very specific mathematical language. So you can do some coding in it, but it really probably isn't a general purpose programming language. It's much more a math specific language. And then at MSc level, we were heavily embedded with Java. So we were doing coding in Java through an IDE called Eclipse, which, if you haven't seen it, looks something like the thing I grabbed somebody else's screenshot of Eclipse over on the right hand side there, with this thing in the bottom. That work was probably quite algorithmic focused. It's quite low level, and I guess there's a sort of a lingering disconnect on both sides, really, with the sorts of programming we were typically doing for our research. So, the low level stuff, maybe there was a little bit of a gap between that for some students, at least, and actually applying that to a useful sort of mathematical problem. And on the Maple side, you were maybe sat at quite a high level, and therefore you couldn't really do quite so much of the algorithmic stuff, or at least not with any degree of kind of speed in that language. The other thing to say is, I think my experience of maths students generally coming, and I think probably this holds over to the more interdisciplinary group as well, is that anytime you run a particular introductory programming course, you have this really wide range of students that you're addressing. So that's what's over on the right hand side there is the results of a survey that I used to run with students in maths coming into our MSc computing course of how much coding have you done before, and you can see a quarter of them are essentially saying none. Certainly half are none to pretty much none. And then you've got this very sort of another quarter that's sort of high to expert, so that's done a lot of code. And that's a really wide range to be addressing. It's really quite tricky to address that kind of scope, but I think is a really common feature actually whenever you run particularly an intro coding course. You have this really wide spectrum of students that have have managed to do some before somewhere, and some that have done none at all, have managed to avoid it completely. And that's true even in sort of technical subjects like maths. And I think it's probably a feature of this interdisciplinary kind of MSc as well, that you get this sort of mix of students who are very capable and have had lots of experience, and then this core that haven't. And I think it's also a thing that sort of seems to me to reset as soon as you reach MSc as well. So whatever you do for your own students at undergraduate level, when you start doing an introductory coding course at MSc level, essentially that same mix crops up again, because you get students from places where they just haven't had the experience of doing any coding before. So my sense was, looking at the courses we were doing, thinking about what do we do with this course moving forward, and we were thinking about transitions to maybe a different programming language. That was one of the big challenges, was how do you keep, this core of students that have done plenty interested alongside this core of students who have done no programming before. And actually probably that sort of less experienced end is somewhat more challenging to get them up and to a certain level. What other things did I struggle with? So Eclipse is a bit of a nightmare to kind of install and configure, and I ended up having to do quite a lot of actually computational support, computer support tasks that felt like they really weren't my job. But at the same time, there is this challenge that particularly when you're trying to get coding languages installed on students' computers, just casting that student across to kind of these central support services is usually not very helpful, because you actually need really quite technical tasks to be done, and those support services aren't usually very well equipped for that. So you have this sort of uneasy mix of you trying to help support things and sometimes trying to send people to central services. And I found that actually trying to get stuff installed on students' computers was a complete nightmare. You would often turn up to a laptop that was poorly configured, that had some other install of Windows that was perhaps in some, the default was some language you didn't speak. Maybe the keyboard settings were in a language you couldn't use, all of which added a level of complexity of doing any installations on students' computers that was fairly nightmarish. Alongside that, you've got your own machines, so maybe you keep a computer studio designed ready to go for students to use there and then. But I often found that things like the file system was a bit clunky, everything was locked down. Sometimes those machines took ages to turn on and actually start up at the beginning of a session, which seems like it should be trivial, but actually ends up sucking out time from the teaching time that you wanted. Lots of that access to that room can be quite limited as well, either because just by capacity or by time. So there were various issues with, that just saying, okay, well, we'll run a computer lab, we'll run a separate computing studio for doing that. I found that, particularly with the language we were using, languages, I guess, Maple and Java, they tended to sit at the wrong level as well. We seem to have opted to do things that didn't quite match with the sorts of applied problems that our students would probably pick up in a dissertational project. And so, we had lots of low-level algorithmic stuff, and there's an example on the right-hand side here of some algorithmic thing that we were doing in Java. Or they were quite high level, like the Maple, that was maybe sat at a level that didn't quite get far enough into the algorithmic stuff, but neither was quite sort of matched up to the stuff that we were doing at research, for research kind of computing. I had to do things like I had to run a midterm because we decided to opt for this fairly low level Java course. And the consequences of that were, well, if you put a question out that has, develop an algorithm to do this, well, they can probably search for that stuff online in a way that bothered us, and that it didn't feel very project-like. It felt very like a cute question and a very definitive answer. So we were a bit uncomfortable about that. So we ended up doing things like midterms, which was just really awkward in the way, at least that our university worked. If you look at that code on the side, the other thing that I will point out that I found myself doing a lot, I don't know how visible it is on everybody's screen, so apologies if it's really tiny for you. But what you'll see there is some comments that are actually the sorts of comments that you would normally put in a piece of code. And you'll see some comments which are sort of a comment to the reader to say, by the way, this line is doing this. that aren't the sort of comments that you'll put in code. And I got a real sense from when I was providing code to students that I was doing this really sort of mixed bag thing where it was hard for them to understand kind of what was I intending them to reproduce and what was I putting in that code just to facilitate their understanding. And that's a slightly uneasy mix when you do all of that through code comments. I've tended to find myself over commenting code. I have to say that's an example on the right there, written by somebody else. So that's maybe not as over commented as I would tend to make them. But you know, it's certainly a feature that I found. So how did that shift when we moved to Noteable then? So we did this double shift essentially. We shifted across to using Noteable as a cloud computing platform, and we shifted across from languages in Java and this language Maple across to using Python. Well, the first and the most obvious and notable thing for me as a lecturer was suddenly I freed myself from the pain of having to do installs on anybody's machines, which was an utter joy. So I could actually focus on the material in the course rather than trying to get everybody essentially wasting an entire workshop at the beginning of the course trying to get people started in just using the machine that they had in front of them. I think if you think back to that Eclipse snapshot of the IDE, I think there's a lot there that's really intimidating and off-putting for that. Again, thinking of that kind of quarter that I had that had never done any programming before, having these kind of multiple use boxes, code is there, but also the file system's there. There's a lot going on that IDE screen that maybe is quite off-putting. And I spent quite a lot of time trying to get students to configure that screen so that they were comfortable. And even then, you know, there was still a lot of which button should I push across the toolbar at the top, and I don't quite understand how all this all links together. So I think one of the joys of notebooks, particularly thinking of that audience, which is the one that I'm often most concerned about bringing up to speed, the kind of the lower experience end. Notebooks are really good for that. It encourages this very literate programming style where you've got, you know, instructions to the reader slightly separated out from the code, but you can kind of work all of that through together in a really coherent way that I think is really nice. And you can do things like link the documentation. So if you look at that example that I'm giving over on the right, that's one of my notebooks about introducing this module pandas, which is for doing stuff with spreadsheets, essentially, data frames. And you can see that, you know, my headline thing is there's a lot of links out to the documentation. And I really enjoyed the way that worked with the language Python as well. It has this kind of open source kind of community around it, and there's quite a lot of nice linkable documentation that it's good to put out there. If you put it in a link in a notebook, it's already in the browser, so that the hope is that students are much more likely to click through and follow that. The way I used to do stuff, you would provide the link, but it would probably be somewhere else, and whether anyone ever clicked it, who knows. And I really had that sense as well when I used to provide something like a Java file and say, okay, load this Java file up and here's your example. When I would go around and talk to students, what you would discover is that very few of them had actually opened that file and run it and looked at it and really absorbed it. Whereas when it's all in line and you really can't avoid the examples as part of what you're doing in the workshop, that problem just disappears in a way that you know, you don't have it anymore, because the notebook is the thing. That's the thing you're working through, and that has the examples in it. I think for that reason, the whole thing is kind of easier to scaffold. And again, particularly thinking about that kind of the students with less experience of doing this kind of stuff, it feels to me much easier to scaffold them through the early stages of how do you just even get going, which I think quite a lot of them find quite intimidating. Yeah, I think another side effect is we generally kind of shifted away from providing computers for students. So you know, one side effect of this is that you can get Notable through a browser. You can get a browser up on pretty much anything. I mean, you know, if I squint and say pretty much anything, it's probably about true. But in particular, students will get much more comfortable accessing it much more routinely and on their own devices. They feel much more in control of that in a way that you don't get if you have to go to a computer lab to use the piece of software. So, you know, students did indeed do that. They bring their own devices a lot more. They get used to using it on their own devices. And because that was just such a shift, we had students literally sat on a laptop parked in front of the machine that we provided them in the computer lab, up to which we kind of felt, well, why are we providing a computer lab? Do we really need to anymore? So we went through a whole exercise of actually taking our computer lab out and making sure that students had a laptop, so providing a laptop loan scheme to make sure we covered any gaps. But essentially our expectation was that this became our computer use became a bring your own device thing, because that was now enabled by actually that being accessible through a browser. So if I were to pick out kind of the key things that I think are a big deal then from all of that, I think having a cloud-based solution actually really opens up an awful lot that maybe we don't foreground very much. But stuff like, do you really need a computer lab? Well, if you've got a cloud-based solution, maybe you don't in quite the same way. We were moving across to Python and R, and having that notebook format just seemed to make a lot of sense for keeping our students all in touch. And that's something obviously you get from Noteable. I think so James mentioned this idea of an LTI link. So here's my example over on the right hand side. So this is a snapshot of my Python course from about, I think we shifted over about 7 years ago. I was trying to work out exactly when it was. It's some time ago anyway. So here's the picture from about, I think this is about 6 or 7 years ago, of what my Python course looked like. You can see a big Notable link at the top. If you go into this is a snapshot of our VLE. So you can see a big Notable link. If you click through, you get straight through to Notable without having to log in again. Just takes you straight there and sucks the credentials through on this LTI link. You can see the sorts of things that I was doing, providing a notebook and a bit of context for students to download and then upload onto Notable. So, you have to take them through that process if that's what you do. I had other colleagues that got used to using kind of Git and putting stuff on GitHub and getting students to pull it from GitHub. I never did that, partly for the reason that I think, again, thinking about those students that have done less of this stuff, that probably feels less comfortable. It feels a bit more artificial, whereas I think they all get their heads around downloading a file from the internet and uploading it, and then they can do that with their own data later, which is a big part of what we did in the assessments, which I'll talk about in a little bit as well. What else is there? Well, consistent module provision, one of the things that did occasionally become a bit of an irritation when you use Python and people are running it locally on their own machines, is they maybe have a different version of a particular module and stuff stops working or it starts working. Well, it's nice and consistent if it's all on a cloud platform. I think that the really key thing for me, and particularly thinking about the sort of range of audiences, is this low barrier of entry. That's really the upshot of all of that stuff, is that you get this really low barrier of entry to get started, which I think is a really nice thing. With my kind of managerial hat on, so we did consider a bunch of other stuff. So we did use RStudio Cloud for a little bit. We thought very heavily about Google Colab. We thought about CoCalc. We still use a bit of VS Code, so we still wanted students to get that, our undergraduate students particularly, to get that IDE experience. So we thought that was still an essential thing. So they still do a bit of that as a separate entity, just to kind of see that. Various reasons why either we stopped using those things or we never started using them. Quite a lot of them around that credentials thing, actually. So, the LTI link is a really big bonus. Things like Google Colab, well, you have to start mixing up students making Google accounts, and then is that their personal account? How does that fit in with using it for university work? And as the lecturer, if you're trying to take things like assignments from there, will they have the student's username that relates to something in the university, or will it be the Google account? And things get very messy very quickly. So by and large, we have reasons why we didn't opt for lots of those things. Right, I'll say a little bit about the kind of the newer bit of teaching then, this interdisciplinary teaching. So for the last few years, I've been teaching on this interdisciplinary set of MSCs, and they all have a common core around stuff that I do, I guess, so the bits that are me. So some of that's some data science. So we do an intro data science course, we do a data visualization course, and we do this other course that sort of sprang out of this kind of interdisciplinary mix of people that were delivering things called Text Remix, which is this really probably slightly off the wall approach to programming, but teaching programming whilst doing creative writing. So it's this kind of mix of creative writing and programming together, which is, I think, is really cool, and is a kind of approach to doing programming in just a completely different way. It's not the kind of the maths first way that we might normally do stuff. For me, Notable was essentially the key element that made all of that work, that made it possible. It's that low barrier of entry, very clear language, very literate notebook style. All of those things are really, really important. And then the other thing is, Python is just this good mix of something that's really good at dealing with lots of different types of things, lots of different types of data, and it's just powerful enough to get you to some problems that students who maybe aren't interested in programming for its own sake, they actually get to things they really do care about, which is nice. So we take students through all of that, to how to interact with this online space, how to download and upload, so I talk through all of that. How do you download a notebook? How do you get it on there? How do you get some data from a website and get it onto Noteable so that they kind of learn how to do that stuff? How to make visualizations and then take the images out of Noteable so you can use them for something else. How to collaborate together. So we do quite a lot of kind of things like pair programming was one of the big paradigms particularly for the data science course. Notable platforms brilliant in allowing this kind of consistent working environment. So going in at the beginning of the year, these are the modules that exist, and you can rely on them, and they're not going to suddenly change or disappear, which is really nice. It's really, really nice and easy, and everybody has access to the same things. So we use this kind of mix of things like Spacey and sklearn and Altair largely for data visualization. We did use a couple of more obscure things, but then of course the nice thing about Python is that you can just install stuff as you go. So you can do a quick pip install line there and then and install a module that you're going to use. So we use some weird things, like there was a module called word tree, which gets you from a piece of text, it gets you all of the words that lead into a given word and all of the words that lead out of a given word as a kind of a visual thing. Really nice module, very, very niche. So it's not the sort of thing that you would anybody would provide as a standard thing. But the nice thing is you can always just do a quick pip install for everybody that's there in Python to kind of install modules like that. Our assessments, yeah, so lots of stuff involved, kind of student created notebooks. That tended to be the mode that I've been using both in maths and then later in these courses, either students getting stuff out of these notebooks or just submitting the notebook entire. Yeah, the thing over on the right hand side, there's me showing off the nicest looking Altair visualization that I could find on the fly. So that's the sort of thing that we were doing in the data visualization course. And you can kind of see the structure of the notebook once again, with me trying to work some narrative around producing this particular visualization, which is trying to replicate something that came from somebody else's website. So that's the kind of the narrative that I've woven around that in the notebook. One thing that might be worth talking a little bit about is for the text course, we decided we couldn't really teach a text and programming course and not address things like ChatGPT coming along and all these large language models being able to generate text in a way that wasn't possible before. So we started off with GPT-2 back only 2 years ago, and last year we actually embedded ChatGPT through API calls. So that was a nice thing. I was a bit skeptical whether that would work, but actually was pleasantly surprised. So I don't know. I always live in slight fear that I'm going to stretch the students too far, and they always surprise me with how brilliantly well they do. Actually, they really got the idea of what an API call was, and thankfully we had a lot of support from our school to set up basically a proxy server. So we were making the API calls, but instead of going to OpenAI, these API calls were going to this proxy server that would respond exactly, that would forward them to OpenAI and then respond back with the thing, so that we could do some kind of good use policies and metering of the whole thing, so that nobody spent too much money with OpenAI in the middle. But that worked really well. We got some really interesting stuff out of that. Students kind of understood the bits of that API call they were supposed to edit and the bits they weren't. Worked really nicely. We had some really nice uses of that in the assessments, and I'll say a little bit more about that in just a second. Yeah, my experience has been with these interdisciplinary courses that if you enable this kind of environment for students, they're just endlessly inventive with stuff in ways that, particularly coming from a disciplinary background in maths, I wouldn't have envisaged doing. So, you know, we've had students making haiku from song lyrics and fortune tellers, and one student organized 3D printing of kind of density of Airbnbs in Edinburgh to make this kind of physical object. We had students working on kind of global forest watch data, looking at deforestation, educational attainment in the UK schools, UFO sightings in the US. So all sorts of bits and pieces of data in all sorts of ambitious ways that have been really, really interesting, and doing interesting stuff with them. We set ourselves some quite ambitious goals for some of these courses. So particularly in the data science one, we weren't presuming any particular prior knowledge, and we were getting students to get through to doing some machine learning using sklearn by the time they got to the end, which felt quite ambitious. The thing over on the right hand side, this is a sort of poem that students were making from by remixing some text together, spacing it out in fancy ways, and beginning to make kind of basically poems out of the things that they found, and kind of using those for inspiration for their own work, really. So, you know, there was this interactive bit where that wasn't necessarily the end product. Actually, the end product was them interacting a bit more with that afterwards. Okay, last couple of slides, I promise. I was going to say something about assessment. So the sorts of things that we've been doing, you know, either students are handing back a whole notebook with things in. Quite often those have been group projects, so students are able to tackle more interesting things in a group because they could just get a bit further. We could set them more complicated problems. So my feeling, particularly in that transition in the maths courses from pre-Notable to post-Notable, actually we got far more interesting stuff done. You know, I set people problems to do with real data. So we used the bike share data when there was a bike sharing scheme in Edinburgh. We did some real interesting optimization problems with those that just wouldn't have been possible in something like Java. You wouldn't have been able to do it in the time. So we really encourage people towards that kind of real world, real application stuff, which I think just makes all of the skills involved much, much more marketable once they're done. They can really talk about those things at interview, and kind of whatever comes next. We found some really interesting things when we did embed things like ChatGPT calls. Students, you know, they found ways to use those large language models that I thought were really inventive. So for, you know, one student project was about finding recipes. You would type in keywords that were particular ingredients. They would, from a database of recipes, they would pull a recipe, but they didn't stop there. They also let you kind of change it to be like, you know, could you make it gluten-free? And they used the large language model to do that conversion, which I thought was a really interesting use of kind of patching up stuff that you would find actually really challenging to code, really difficult, but actually kind of using the LLM to kind of fill in some gaps in a quite intelligent way. So we got some really interesting things out of doing that. Yeah, more generally, I think you know, my feeling is we better prepare students for the kinds of project work that we generally want to see. Last thing to say then is about MB Grader. So if you haven't used that before, this is this notebook grading tool that allows you to have some hand mark pieces within your notebook, but also some auto mark pieces. So there's a little bit of markup that you have to do in the code cells in order to kind of flag that something's going to be auto marked later. And there's this really nice interface that, you know, largely works around kind of push-pull things. You push something out to the students for them to work on, and then at the deadline, you pull all of those back in from their user spaces in order to be able to see a whole bunch of notebooks, which you can then push a button and auto mark the auto mark bits, and then go through one by one and hand mark the other bits. So that worked really well. I was really pleased with that. It actually enables you to save a bunch of time. You can ask about stuff that maybe is a bit more routine, but you don't mind it being auto marked and actually the feedback being kind of fairly minimal. Actually, you can ask about that stuff all in line. It works quite well. So there's a little bit of an overhead in terms of explaining to students what's going on, what buttons to push, and kind of, that there's a deadline, and when you hit the deadline, you're going to fetch them all out of their spaces in order to work on all of that kind of stuff. But the trade-off is you gain a bit in the marking because you can do some of this auto mark stuff, and that worked quite well for us. The way that the VLE link works, that LTI link works, usually what we're doing is compiling that separately, and then that gets uploaded as a mark somewhere else. So certainly that's how we've tended to deal with it. The marking just exists in Notable for the time being, and then at some point you make a big spreadsheet from Notable that's all of the marks and pull that through to your VLE. And or if there's special arrangements, obviously they always look awkward, so we tended to try and minimize that for that sort of assessment. Right, rather than say the quick summary, because I think I probably took longer than I should have, I'm gonna leave that slide up and say, yeah, if you want to ask any questions about any of those things that we've touched on, I'd be very happy.
How's that? Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stuart. Just keeping an eye on the chat there for any questions that have come through, but none yet, which just shows testament to how well you are providing insights and sharing your experience. So we'll give it a few more minutes, as we have about 10-15 minutes before the end of the session. And we can always, of course, wrap up a bit early if people are keen to go to the lunch and don't have any questions. But Stuart, from what you described, I mean, I took away so much in terms of what an experience has been, and the transformation from downloading things, coding in Java, sharing those examples was really insightful on your slides. A starting question from me is, how would you anticipate that the results of the computing background survey might have changed now, or do you think they will have changed? And I understand that the kind of mark has also changed alongside with that question of what coding is.
So my experience is it hasn't shifted very much. So when I've tended to ask that question in every coding class that I run, partly because I look around the room when I ask it at the beginning. I usually ask it on one of these sort of interactive Q&A things, right? So whatever tool you use, simply because what happens is when you show the result, all of the students that went, I've never done any before, go, oh, everybody else too. It's like there's this real thing that it changes the atmosphere in the room. You get a sort of, everybody relaxes quite considerably. So yeah, my experience has been, it hasn't shifted that much. So caveat for that is obviously I've shifted audience a little bit in that time. So from maths over to maybe a slightly more technical audience over to a slightly more generalist audience. But yeah, actually that mix, if anything, there's probably more students who've done nothing before, nothing at all. I think in maths, to be honest, that mix has always been there. I'd be surprised if it shifts much. It's just, it seems to be a feature of the discipline that not everybody covers much in the way of programming. It's possible to avoid it, essentially, in lots of maths degrees.
Yeah. No, that's interesting, because you described you've been able to design your current work essentially around interdisciplinary things, that stuff that you do, right, in a bunch of different areas. And hearing you talk about the scaffolding, kind of building that edifice of computational thinking, makes me wonder how variable it is across different disciplines, and how much the need has either been leaning towards the need is provided by one tool, or it's actually become more specialized in how those tools are being built. So thanks again, Stuart. I did see one question that was on the chat that seems to have disappeared for me now. It was a question around grade passback. And for anyone who might be wondering what that is, Stuart, you mentioned that MB grader assignment exchange side of things that's in Notable. And grade passback is something that you also describe, Stuart, as at the moment being essentially a spreadsheet that you can download when you're ready to export your grades. So give an update on that, because we have been working on that feature for some time, and integrating that a bit further into the course environment. We are working that feature over the summer in terms of grade pass back into the virtual learning environment. So you wouldn't have to export a spreadsheet file, but it would go directly back to your course environment. So if anyone who was wondering about that, or the person who asked that question had that answered there, hopefully that was helpful. And Peter, there was a question about trialing the software, and thanks, Anna, for sharing the link for that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'm a bit of a control freak, so I do quite like having the spreadsheet in the middle, because I like having control of that. There's this issue, particularly for us, that you've got to persuade a course secretary to set up all of the right columns in the VLE to make sure the passback works exactly as anticipated. So, it's not. I don't know. For me, there's a sort of a balance there between the two approaches as well. It's not obvious that the passback is that's the thing that's definitely best either in every case.
Of course, yeah. Very good point there, Stuart, around the need for options to be available, depending on your course needs and how you're set up, and how the course is being administered, essentially, to an extent. So happy to report you can still export it with the command that you've been using, Stuart. No problems, no worries at all there. So thanks for that.
James, can I just ask a quick question? Stuart and other people behind Stuart who I know use Noteable at Edinburgh, have you used it within an examinations context at all? Having been at a former large university and witnessed the disaster that was trying to do our studio exam in a 200-seat cluster, where it was all locally installed, was exceptionally stressful. So I just wondered whether that kind of online Noteable experience had been used in that similar kind of scenario at all?
Well, so midterms, not so much exams. Yeah, I think I did one midterm. I was very rapidly trying to avoid doing it because it consistently was a nightmare. So I had a terrible experience one year where somebody who was in the room after me had turned had scheduled for the computers all to switch into exam mode, which meant switching off the internet, whilst I was in the middle of doing my exam, where I didn't really care whether we switched off the internet or not because it was open book. And that switched all the machines off right in the middle of my internet. So ever since that, I've been really put off the idea. My sense is that I would encourage people not to do it more than anything, because it just feels inauthentic as a sort of coding experience. Actually, how often do we sit in a closed box and never look at the documentation or the internet, and are expected to just code from our head straight onto a blank screen? Well, basically never. That feels very artificial. So I think my encouragement when people have talked about that, certainly when I was director of teaching, was could we just not do that, because it does feel quite inauthentic as an assessment method. But so yeah, so not really lots of experience, sorry, but more maybe directing people away from it.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Anna and Stuart. I'll just give a bit of a note to answer your question as well. There have been a couple of examples that we know of that have used Noteable for exams. Most recently, there was a data analysis and machine learning course that used Noteable for examination conditions, and that had a couple of different sessions. There were 3 sessions that each was 70 minutes long, and it was all done in a similar lab setup to what Stuart described. So we've heard for courses like that, especially in physics and machine learning, that the lab has essentially now become a exam space for those types of situations.
I can see one other question under the Q&A tab. What disadvantages have you found to Noteable? Which I can speak to if you like. So I think the 2 use cases where we wasn't quite so suited. So there was a particular course that we ran for a little while that was really keyed to use our Studio Cloud, and it was kind of configured around that. And Noteable wasn't quite the same. So it didn't quite do the same things in the same way. And maybe there was a little bit of, like, there was some particular functionality they needed from our Studio Cloud, which made we had to use that really for that course. And we've actually kind of approached that by getting the course redesigned to take that out, because actually we really didn't want to use it. But maybe that'll be an instance where if you've got something that's really specifically already tuned to something else, okay, there might be a little bit of shift to kind of get it to work in Notable. I think the other thing was just a more broad philosophical thing around, there's still some colleagues that feel that the process of writing a .py file, so none of the notebook stuff, just the code, and having that maybe in an IDE, that process is still valuable and that we shouldn't lose that. And you do a bit if you move to notebooks. And so, some of that still exists. Like I say, we're still using VS Code to do some stuff that looks like that. I know physics have a similar sort of kind of dichotomy where they want similar sorts of things to that going on in Edinburgh as well. That they kind of want that some of that experience to happen. So maybe that would be an example of something that was a disadvantage. If you really want that kind of IDE experience, okay, well, it isn't really quite that. Or at least maybe that's not what it's best at in some sense, because there is this sort of IDE, Jupyter IDE thing that kind of replicates that to some extent.
Thanks very much there, Stuart. That reminds me to mention to you, Stuart, and to the wider group, as an update as well, we are currently testing VS Code on beta for the service to look at providing something more like an IDE flavor type of notebook environment.
And I think it's fair to say as well, given the prohibitive costs of our studio server, is it now Posit? I'm trying to think, it's changed its name, hasn't it? It's probably, if you find that Notable doesn't incorporate something that you would want, then to get in touch with the EDINA team to see whether there's a chance to incorporate that functionality into the product. Just as an aside, because I was on a call a few weeks ago with a number of institutions who had licensed our studio server, but it was extremely expensive and quite prohibitive, so they couldn't expand the number of people who were being able to use it in their teaching. So I think it's always worth asking that question. So I'd encourage you to direct any queries like that to James and the rest of the EDINA team, because it could be something that they could include in a future release.
Yeah, we're always curious to hear all different types of uses of R in our studio. And as you say, Anna, it's really asking the question because there's often different uses. Different courses might have different needs that might be better suited for the cloud type packaged bundle, and others might be needing something more like an integrated service like Notable. Great, so some great questions there. Just seeing the 5-minute marker for the call passed by a couple minutes ago. So just to see if there's any final questions. I did have a slide sharing our email addresses, but maybe we can distribute the slides after to attendees, which will have those in there for anyone who would like to ask any follow-up questions. Oh yes, that's one of the questions. Can we get the slide deck sent over? So yes, absolutely. I'm happy to send the slides for EDINA, and Stuart, if you want to revise anything on yours, we can do that. And if you're happy sharing, we can also share those over. And the link to the recording as well. And there should be a transcript with that too. Great, good stuff. So it's gone a bit quiet on the chat and Q&A front, but some good questions had come in there. So this might be our wrap up then for this afternoon's webinar. So I'll thank everyone again for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully you found what you heard about Notable and computational notebooks provided by EDINA helpful and insightful. Stuart, thank you again for joining us. Really, really cool insights as always, and you're working on a number of really interesting interdisciplinary things. And thanks, Anna, for joining on the GIST side to answer any questions about licensing. So thanks again, everyone. Wishing you a good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, we'll wrap up there. We kept the time extremely well. Thank you, everyone.
That's not bad.
All right. Yep. I think
I have no idea how long I ran over.
No,
it's only 13:29 now, so thank you.
yeah,
That's,
absolutely.
It can't be that bad then. Okay, good.
that was really interesting, Stuart. So many moons ago, that I did applied maths at Leeds Uni, so that was my area.
Right.
So yeah, I was like listening to you, and also when I was in IT there, I was helping support the maths people teaching Python to and it was their research postgraduates. They did like these introductory courses, and yeah, there was a lot of pain.
Yeah. Yeah. Cloud services are the way to go, honestly. It makes
I think with
it so much more easy to actually teach them this stuff.
with anything that's constantly being updated and has plugins and add-ons, and it was like one of those nominal things. It's freeware, but hey, the headache that it gave everybody and the amount of actual time, it was right. Well, thank you both.
Excellent.
And I think our other two people have probably gone off to get their lunch.
Yeah, they might be heating up their lunch. Cool, but we should have a recording and transcript all done for the session. I'll just double check with Guy about the details for everyone who joined, and then we'll share the links over.
I'll send you an update of the slides. I only changed the first one really, but just so you've got the very latest.
Great, yeah, thank you, Stuart.
I'll email that over in a second.
And I was thinking of doing the comms to the same mailing list that I did advertising the webinar. We can send the recording link, and I normally put it up on the Chess website. So Stuart, I hope you're happy to be the face of Noteable for the
If they're happy to have me, my goodness.
The star of Noteable.
Of course, yeah. Okay. Happily use all the stuff I have.
No,
that's fine.
That was really interesting, because I mean, I've read the stuff from you guys, James, at Noteable, and I've understood why there's a requirement for it. But I think every time someone speaks about it who actually uses it, you pick up on some extra nuances as to how it's helped them in their particular course. So that was really useful, and I think that whole being able to teach a spread of people with a broader background.
And I think the other big effect for us has been, actually we got rid of our whole computer classroom. That's a big estate change to
that was really
kind of almost incidentally comes out of using a cloud service that I hadn't necessarily thought, oh, that's a consequence, but actually kind of is. Makes big differences to lots of things, really. But
right. Thank you, gentlemen. As you were.
Yes. Right. I'm going to jump off. Right.
Thanks so much, Stuart. Really loved everything you said.
Bye-bye.
Really interesting. And thank you, Anna, for joining. Good to see you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. Enjoy your lunches.